And this is now recording. So today is April 15th, 2011. This is Ruth Swanson. I'm with Albert Barr, SAIS class of 1958 and Bologna class 1957.
That's correct.
And we are in San Rafael. And our first question for you is, how did you make your way to SAIS? How did you find out about SAIS when it was not very well known?
Well, my first year was at the Bologna Center. And I was recommended, or the Bologna Center was recommended to me by a history professor at the University of Rochester, Professor May, who I think was a friend of Seagrove Haynes. And he recommended the Bologna Center to me because I had taken my junior year in Munich, Germany, so I spoke some German. And frankly, both experiences were life-changing experiences, both the year in Germany and, of course, the year in Bologna. The year in Bologna was a very interesting year from a diplomatic point of view because 1956 was the Suez Crisis and the Hungarian uprising, which was terribly exciting in Bologna. Because, as you may know, Bologna itself was, and I think still is, the largest communist city in Italy.
Are you a classmate of Joe Dukert?
No.
Oh, okay.
No.
He told a recent story, so I wanted to check.
Anyway, it was a fun experience being in Bologna that year, and then I took my second year at SAIS in Washington. And
tell us about your year in Washington.
Well, it was fun being in Washington itself and being in that part of the city. As you know, SAIS at that time was in a former girls' school, I understand, on Florida Avenue. The first two floors were lecture halls, rooms, offices, and the third and fourth floor were dormitory rooms. I had a single up on I think the fourth floor, men only at that time. The women lived in rooms around the school. So it was a fun experience. There was a little snack bar downstairs and a restaurant across Connecticut Avenue. I made a lot of friends, both in Bologna particularly and in Washington, friends that we see today. As a matter of fact, we're going to have a mini reunion in New York the beginning of June. Oh,
really? How nice. Will you be going to Amici di Bologna?
Well, it started with that, but frankly, we are going to have our own reunion in a friend's apartment, Phil Futterman's apartment on Central Park West, and then we're going out to dinner. Hank Joyce and Hank Johnson are coming up from Washington, and Ken and Gloria Liatzis are coming down from Boston. We might have a couple of other folks at a little reunion in New York.
Wonderful.
So it shows we go way back, and we've stuck together. We've taken some trips together. We've done a lot of traveling, especially with Ken and Phil Futterman. Several trips that they've asked me to organize. I don't know whether we'll continue to do that again, but it was a lot of fun.
What's your most vibrant memory of SAIS?
It's hard to say. Just the experience of being at the school at that time in Washington. I like to go to museums and being able to walk over to the Phillips Collection in Dumbarton Oaks. Some of the professors that we got to know personally. Dr. Victor Sullum, who's no longer with us, was a supporter. He recommended some opportunities for me. But quite frankly, after graduating SAIS, I still had the military to contend with, the draft. And I managed to get myself into a Air Force Reserve unit in Sacramento. So I came out to California. My brother was living in Sacramento at the time. And then of course I visited some businesses in San Francisco to try to find employment after my reserve duty was over. Frankly, people in San Francisco at that time had never heard of SAIS. They wondered what I was doing out in San Francisco. But one man told me my educational experience was interesting, but he said, look, you don't know anything about business, you don't know anything about accounting or marketing, So he suggested that I go to the Thunderbird School in Phoenix, Arizona, which at that time was somewhat of a trade school, but the tuition was reasonable, so I did that, and I was hired by Chase at the Thunderbird School. I believe they probably saw that I had taken one course at SAIS in African Studies. And they, at that time, were planning, and they did open a branch in Monrovia, Liberia. So I'm sure the man who interviewed me designated me to go to Liberia, which I did after about 2 years of training in New York. So that was an interesting experience. We were newly married at the time. I saw a bit of Africa. We did some traveling on the west coast of Africa. Liberia was a functioning country at that time. And then we came back, and then I was assigned to the Asian area in New York City, dealing with Japanese banks and corporations, lending them dollars to rebuild their country. And then I was posted to Seoul, South Korea, as manager of the branch in Seoul. No, I'm sorry. First I went to Hong Kong for 2 years, Hong Kong branch. And then Seoul, and for 3 years, and then I was manager of the branches in Greece for 3 years, and then back to New York for another 3 years. But it all had a logical sequence, starting with my junior year in Munich, and then SAIS, and then Chase.
Interesting. Was there any particular class that stood out that has informed your work or that you've gone back to over the years?
Well, Solom's class, I forgot what the title was, frankly, but he was keen on teaching us to think. One of his favorite ploys was to come in and ask us questions about current events. And I found out the key was to read The Economist. And he would pick out issues or articles in The Economist that he would question. And he taught us not to take things at face value. There were sometimes typographical errors, like once actually in my oral exam, he asked a question from the New York Times. I passed Sunday's New York Times about foreign exchange reserves in Italy. And there was a typo in that article. And he asked me about it. And quite frankly, I had made a mental note of it. And I answered the question correctly. And I think that's what got me through my orals, was that question. But he was an interesting fellow, a very nice guy. Other than that, some of the social experiences were interesting. Or I don't know whether you know that during a lecture in the building on Florida Avenue, and the afternoon lecture, right after lunch as a matter of fact, the ceiling collapsed on students.
Bob, who's the instructor? Bob Tucker.
Bob Tucker, that's right.
It was his class.
That's right.
We had an interview with him.
Oh, really? He was
a
a very well-dressed guy who puffed a little cigarillo all the time. I don't think they smoke cigarillos in class anymore. But part of the plaster came down and hit Sandy Hughes, a friend of mine, on the head, and had a big gash on his forehead, as I recall. Now, the first thing he'd do is go to a lawyer and sue. But he wasn't seriously injured, and the lecture continued after the ceiling came down on us.
Bob Tucker did not tell that part in his retelling.
No, but that was a weird experience. But it was fun. We had some other professors. Well, oh yes, one professor, I forgot his name, frankly, unfortunately, but he was an historian with the State Department. And brought to class one evening a map, a copy of a captured map. It's the State Department at that time was going through the German documents that they captured after the war. and he brought the class a copy of the map that was signed by Ribbentrop and Molotov, dividing Poland in half on August 23rd, I think, 1939. And of course, once the Germans had concluded that agreement with the Russians, a week later, Germany invaded Poland. Now, since I worked in the library as a part-time librarian in the evening, he entrusted the copy of the map to me to bring back the next week to the class. Well, I made a copy of the copy, which I still have.
Oh, do you?
And
Is that something you might share with SAIS sometime?
yes, sure. I'll make it's not the best copy in the world because we didn't have very good Xerox machines in those days. And I think I went to a copy shop or a place nearby, and but that for many, many years, until very relatively recently, that map was top secret in Russia. It was a big secret that, of course, Stalin had signed this agreement with Hitler. Stalin and Hitler didn't sign it themselves because von Ribbentrop and Molotov signed it, and they put the date in Roman letters on the map. But that was people might say, well, that map has since been published. It's in the public domain now, but at that time it was not. And it was sort of an interesting artifact. I think I had it framed once. I don't know where. I got it downstairs someplace, but I'll make a copy for you.
That would be wonderful. Thank you. With regard to your career, what would you like SAIS to know about it? What are you most proud of? Is there something you think historians would be curious about?
Well, that's hard to say. Looking at the Bologna Center for a moment, both Ken Liatzos and I and Phil Futterman advocated to the previous director, Maria, I forgot her name, she was a former ambassador, that the Bologna Center develop a course in Mediterranean studies. Having lived in Greece for 3 years during the colonels and the democratic government, and in that time there was a war, quote, a war for a week between Greece and Turkey over Cyprus. And to this day, Cyprus is a little cancer, if you will, within NATO. It's probably one of the reasons why Turkey will never be admitted into the European community, because they've allowed the Greek portion of Cyprus to become a member of the European community, and the Greek Cyprus will veto Turkish admission into the European community. So that issue has to be settled. And about, if my memory serves me correctly, about 10 years ago, both Greece and Turkey had fairly liberal foreign ministers. One was Papandreou, who's now prime minister. And we felt the time would have been right to bring the Turkish and Greek business community together to discuss Cyprus and a means of reconciliation. And both Ken and I and Phil Futterman contributed some money. We sponsored a symposium in Bologna, and there was a second symposium. Well, not too many Greek businessmen attended, but some Turks did. But unfortunately, it really didn't go beyond that. However, the director of the Bologna Center at the time said she wanted to carry this idea forward and develop get funding for a chair in Mediterranean studies. And I think that's still a good idea, because look at the issues that we're facing now. North Africa, the whole Mediterranean. And of course, it's a complex area. But I think it would be a fascinating area to study. Just like when we were in Bologna, when I was in Bologna, the main focus was European unification. There was a class trip to the European coal and steel community I think in the Luxembourg or Strasbourg, I forgot where. I didn't go. I had to work on a paper on southern Italy at the time, so I went to Rome. But so given that tradition of reaching out to institutions, I think it would be worth the effort in getting the Bologna Center, perhaps SAIS, to focus in on the Mediterranean and the issues that the countries around the Mediterranean are facing.
And our last question is, what advice do you have for today's students?
I think the 2 years at SAIS are not sufficient. I think they should take a third year in international business, perhaps in conjunction with a business school. I think Johns Hopkins is doing that themselves. I think Johns Hopkins in Baltimore has started a business school, I believe.
The Carey School of Business.
Right. It might be interesting to do it in conjunction with that institution, or perhaps another one.
There's a very popular SAIS Wharton joint degree program.
Oh, okay. But it's a 2 year. It's combined into a 2 year program.
It is, I believe, a year and a half, three semesters at SAIS and 3 semesters at Wharton.
So it's 3 years in total. Oh, good. I think that should be encouraged. Because I went into business, I didn't want to go into government work, and it was rewarding. While I was overseas, in both, particularly in Korea, both actually in Hong Kong, and in Korea, and to some degree in Greece, but mostly in Hong Kong. I worked very closely in Hong Kong with the American consulate, and in Korea also. The American ambassador in Korea personally thanked me for my co-curricular activities in supporting some of their efforts. In Hong Kong, I was one of the directors of the very early American Chamber of Commerce in Hong Kong. The Brits were not very hospitable towards the American community in Hong Kong at that time for various reasons. But Chase was very conscious in observing the Trading with the Enemy Act. I don't know whether you've ever heard of it, but there's within that law, there's a so-called presumptive list of items that presumed to come now from Cuba or Iran, for example. At that time, it was China. We could not finance the cutting and sewing, the manufacture of men's shirts, because cotton was presumed to come from China, even though it really didn't. There were several items, and Chase, for various reasons, was very strict in observing that. B of A and Citibank were not as strict. So I felt that the presumptive list should be changed. In anticipation of the Secretary of Commerce visiting Hong Kong, his name was Maurice Stans at that time, who was very close to Nixon. He was one of Nixon's fundraisers. So I, as being a member of the chamber, or a director of the chamber, not so much as assistant manager of Chase in Hong Kong, drafted a position paper addressed to the Secretary of Commerce, recommending that they revise this presumptive list. Now, there was a man from the Treasury Department stationed in Hong Kong who was very much against it, because his responsibility was enforcing the Trading with the Enemy Act. So I didn't tell him what I was doing, obviously. We gave this paper to Stans, and when the Treasury representative heard about it, he was furious at me personally, but that's the breaks. 3 or 4 or 5 months later, the U.S. government adopted all of our recommendations in revising the list, the presumptive list, except one. They wouldn't let American oil companies bunker, as they say, ships in Hong Kong. That means supplying them with oil, because the ships presumably were going to Vietnam during the Vietnam War. But nevertheless, this was before, of course, Nixon, of course, made his famous visit to see Mao in Beijing. But I think it could have been interpreted by the Chinese as an indication that the Americans wanted to, normalize relations. And this was perhaps a minor point, but nevertheless it was rewarding because Chase benefited. We could then now finance some of the textile businesses in Hong Kong. As a small point, for example, the American Chamber of the American Club in Hong Kong was moving to another building, and they had to buy new furniture for the dining room. Well, furniture was on the presumptive list, but now that the presumptive list was changed, the American Chamber, the American Club, was able to buy furniture locally for the American Club, against the wishes of the representative of Treasury. But anyway, this was just an example of some of the co-curricular activities that you get involved in if you're interested in doing so.
Do you continue to follow closely U.S.-Sino relations?
Oh yes, yes. I've been to China a couple of times. I've given lectures and I've done a lot of overseas volunteer consulting, and I've had a couple of assignments in China.
Is there anything else you'd like to share with us that you wish I had asked about that we would want to know?
Well, I'm retired. I was fortunate to be able to do a lot of volunteer work. Most of it was financed indirectly by USAID. I've had about a dozen assignments in the former Soviet Union, especially in Kazakhstan, Ukraine, Moldova, a couple of assignments in Africa. Unfortunately, I think a lot of this work has slowed down because USAID is short of funds. But there might be opportunities, and I suggest that alumni, retired alumni, pursue volunteer consulting. It can be quite rewarding.
That sounds wonderful. Thank you so much for your time.
It's all right. It was very brief.